A major shakeup inside Ukraine's government at a critical
Halo
moment in the
semua,
push for a
jangan
peace
lupa
deal. President
subscribe,
Zelensky's top
like,
aide
dan
and lead
komen.
negotiator, Andriy
Kita
Yermak,
share
has
di
resigned. It happened just hours after his
yang
home was
lain
raided by
agar yang
anti-corruption
lain bisa
police. The
menikmati.
shakeup comes just one day after
Terima
Thanksgiving, with Ukraine
kasih.
and the U.S. set to resume negotiations this weekend, and with Russia signaling its own next move. The New York Post reporting today that it received an impassioned text message from Yermak last night saying that he was headed to the war's front line. Quote, "I am going to the front and am prepared for any reprisals." The Kremlin says a U.S. delegation is expected in Moscow next week, and Vladimir Putin is already laying out new hardline demands, including threats to take additional Ukrainian territory by force if Kyiv doesn't withdraw troops. All of this makes Yermak's exit even more significant. He's been the public face of Kyiv's negotiating team, and just days ago, he said the last major gap with Washington was territory. In fact, before yesterday's raid, Yermak told The Atlantic that Ukraine never cede land to Russia as part of a deal, saying, quote, "Not a single sane person today would sign a document to give up territory." Joining me now is David Lawler, the national security editor at Axios. He's been tracking these negotiations from the start. David, Yermak was deeply unpopular in Ukraine, but he provided a foil. He provided some value to Zelensky in that he was a magnet for discontent and criticism. So I guess the question I want to ask you is whether Zelensky is enhanced or made weaker by this departure.
He looks weaker at the moment. He had been pressed to fire Yermak earlier. He had consistently stood by him, and then finally was forced into this move after Yermak's home was raided as part of this corruption probe. Yermak has been not only chief of staff and not only chief negotiator, but really minister for everything. He's been described as, Zelensky's right arm, the guy who was sort of the enforcer of loyalty to Zelensky internally, and the guy that, as you said, sort of absorbed some of the criticism, not only domestically, but also from abroad. There was a bit of a good cop, bad cop dynamic between the two of them. He's now gone. Zelensky is in the process of shaking up his presidential staff. He might emerge from this with cleaner hands and a sort of a free path to define what the future of Ukraine's government looks like. But at the moment, when your right-hand man is forced out after his home is raided by corruption authorities, it's not going to reflect very well on the guy at the top.
And his departure follows that of two other cabinet-level ministers. I guess this is a glass half empty or half full. You could say this is healthy. This is what a democracy does to cleanse itself of bad behavior at the highest reaches, or others will say Ukraine is up to its old tricks.
Yes, so we actually interviewed Yermak, my Axios colleague Barak Ravid and I, 3 days before his resignation. We asked him about the corruption allegations, and that's how he framed it. Now, of course, he's self-interested a bit. I don't think he knew he was going to be resigning in a couple of days, but he said people who criticize Ukraine for corruption should consider the fact that, if we were really a deeply corrupt authoritarian country, these kind of independent corruption investigations wouldn't be allowed to happen, wouldn't be allowed to proceed to the very highest levels of government. So basically, don't politicize it. Let these processes run their course. Now, it should be said, Yermak was accused of trying to nip this in the bud earlier. So his hands are not entirely clean. But that was his framing on it, that Ukraine is a functioning democracy, and the fact that these corruption allegations should happen reflects well on Ukraine rather than badly.
You've done a lot of reporting as to how the peace negotiations got to where they are now, the development of the talking points and the agreement on the Trump side of the ledger. So where does that go given this news?
Yeah, so as of the last high-level conversations between the U.S. and Ukraine, the decision was reached to come to agreement on all of the other issues besides territory. And so get that all agreed between the U.S. and Ukraine, and then let the presidents talk about territory. You just read off the quote from Yermak saying nobody would agree to give away territory in exchange for peace. That is what they're being asked to do at the moment. The Russian position, as Vladimir Putin just reinforced, is that we're going to take this territory either by force or through negotiations. And the U.S. has backed them up in that, basically, that they think the war is moving in Russia's direction. And so Ukraine will have to make painful territorial concessions in order to get a deal.
And as finally, as you and I are having this conversation, the last 24 hours have been that have seen very aggressive actions by Russia militarily. Say a word about that. I mean, as the talks continue, Putin has got his foot on the gas.
Absolutely. I mean, not only the attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure ahead of the winter, which have continued very intensely, but also on the front lines. You know, it's been slow progress for Russia, but they're continuing to pour more and more men to the front to try to show that they have the military advantage, which of course would give them more leverage in talks. And you can debate whether Putin is actually serious about making a deal at the moment. I think a lot of us doubt that that's the case, but he certainly wants to go into any talks with maximum leverage, which means maximum success on the battlefield.
Dave Lawler from Axios, thank you so much for your expertise. Checking in now on some social media reaction to today's program from the world of X. Michael, the average American does not care about Ukraine. That's sad. We don't think about Ukraine and we don't want to be involved. Most Americans don't want any money sent to Ukraine. We as a country are trillions in debt with many issues at home to solve. Why can't we do common ground? Two things at once. Believe me, I'm well aware of the fact we are $38 trillion in debt. I talk about it here routinely. I've had the folks on from the Peterson Foundation often, but that doesn't mean that we stand by while an ally, while a friend is overrun by an aggressive authoritarian power. I mean, we need to both support Ukraine. I think we can do two things: support Ukraine and be more mindful of how we whittle away that $38 trillion. Are you ready to have the entitlement conversation? Are you ready to pursue some of the strategies that Simpson Bowles advanced on President Obama's initial watch? I am.
With us now is Joel Rubin. He is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and author of the Briefing book on Substack. Now, with Ukraine already appearing to be on board with a version of this proposal earlier in the week, I mean, what do you expect Witkoff and Kushner will actually, one, either focus on during this meeting, but accomplish with this meeting?
Yeah, Omar, it's great to be with you. And diplomacy for the United States is all about getting a deal done that both sides respect and that's sustainable and that our European allies are supportive of as well. And so my hope is that in these talks, we're going to see Ukraine believe and Zelensky believe that he has achieved goals and his goals and gains at the negotiating table that he can live with. My fear is that he's going to get strong-armed, that what we've seen over the past week or so has been a Russia-first diplomacy and a diplomatic initiative to push the argument that Russia wants, which is to take territory from the East and to have that, and pushing that into Ukraine as a piece that they must accept. And so I hope that that isn't what happens, and I hope that Ukraine does get at the table where they believe they can live with.
Well, you know, amid all of this, we've been talking about Zelensky's top advisor resigning as this corruption investigation deepens in the country. And I just wonder, do you think that works against President Zelensky, or is he able to spin this into, I guess, a victory by saying, hey, this shows the system inside Ukraine is working and won't tolerate corruption?
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly bad news when your top lieutenant is essentially corrupt and needs to be tossed to the side. That is not a good sign. So there's really no good way to spin it except to say what you just described. But I do think there's enough of a bench in Ukraine to replace him. President Zelensky is the president. He is the decider ultimately. And there is a cleanup that clearly the Ukrainian people will benefit from. But certainly this is not a good look for the president. But Ukraine, we have to be very clear, is a democracy, and it does not suffer from the kind of autocratic corruption that Vladimir Putin has over his country in Russia.
You know, you were just talking about this fear that the Witkoff-Kushner meeting doesn't turn into, you know, sort of strong-arming Zelensky. And, you know, we heard this leaked audio recording this week of White House Special Envoy Steve Witkoff advising his Russian counterpart on how to deal with President Trump. You know, look, President Trump has defended that, saying, hey, look, this is just diplomacy at work. This is just how you get to a negotiation. But we also heard Trump frame this peace proposal as a potential breakthrough. I just wonder what you make of that whole dynamic.
Yeah, you know, Omar, it makes sense to try to sell a diplomatic offer. The problem is that the target for sale is the wrong target. Steve Witkoff should not be advising Russia on how to convince Donald Trump to support their deal. He should be trying to convince Russia to support our deal and our arrangement. And so that's where the diplomacy, clearly the president's right in all these negotiations back and forth. It's inverse. And that's what makes people nervous, is that it's a Russian-driven diplomatic process and ridden negotiation. That's where we get concerned. That's why I think you saw the heavy pushback from Europe, from Capitol Hill, from the Ukrainians as well. Hopefully they're straightening it out right now. But again, that gives one a lot of concern from a diplomatic perspective.